Great. Okay, hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us for this third event in INTBAU's autumn series. And today we are looking at networking in the built earth world. My name is Harriet Wenberg and I'm Executive Director of INTBAU, which is a global network dedicated to creating better places to live. We were established about 20 years ago and we've got now over 7,000 members. We've got chapters in 34 different countries around the world. So if you don't know us and know our work, and if you're not a free member yet, then would urge you, I think my colleague Juliet will share some details at the end of the talk on how you can join and stay informed of other upcoming talks like this one. So it's a great pleasure for me now to be introducing our three speakers for today. Rowland Keable, begin with Rowland, who's going to lead off today's discussion. Rowland is Honorary Professor and UNESCO Chair on Earth and Architecture, as well as being CEO of Earth Building UK and Ireland, or IBUCI, and Director of Rammed Earth Consulting CIC. As a founding member of IBUCI, Rowland has worked to put Earth in the construction mainstream since 1985. He is an active member of the European Skills Group, working on training standards for earth structures, has negotiated the publication of UK standard NVQ training for earth building and plasters, and has also written construction codes and standards in the UK, Europe, and Africa. And Rowland is joined today by two fellow advocates of earth building, Ben Loescher and Sourabh Phadke. So Sourabh is a mason and architect working with communities in India to help them design and build for themselves using local resources and building practices. Ben Loescher is an architect and co-founder of Loescher Meacham Architects, which is a Los Angeles-based practice specializing in high-performance adaptive reuse projects in California, New Mexico, and Texas. Ben has authored significant updates to the earth and construction provisions of the International Building Code and is also a charter member and chair of the Earth Builders Guild, which is the trade association for earth building in the United States. So three fantastic speakers with three different geographic regions kind of in mind that they're going to bring to bear in what they'll tell us today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over Rowland to you to lead off.
Thanks very much, Harriet. And hello to everybody. So yeah, when I discussed this with Jules and with Harriet, and they said, you know, what is it that you want to talk about? It just seemed to suggest itself that we talk about organizations rather than practices, because we do a lot of that anyway as organizations, dealing with practices and so on. But organizations and networks are more important in a lot of ways, in terms of giving people the confidence to move forward and to understand where they can find sources of information. And this question of networks is I've just seen is more and more important. We started Earth Building UK and what then became UK and Ireland in about 2007, 2008, with a meeting to say, do we really need to have an organization that talks just about Earth? And the answer was yes, because a lot of us were already members of things like the Association of Environmental Conscious Building, but none of them had a particular voice for Earth. And Earth is kind of, it's a global thing. People all around the world use Earth, but there are Earth buildings all around the world already, but nobody really talks about them specifically. There aren't schools of architecture teaching just Earth, and so these were things that we thought were necessary to focus on. And indeed, we found that over time that is the case, that we do need to, when we do focus on these things, that you get a lot of results. As an organization, we don't have a physical address. We've got a website because we're nationally based. In fact, we're based in the UK and Ireland, Scotland and Wales as well, obviously. And so it's what we're trying to do is to network people together and share information and be a source of information and confidence building across the country for quite a range of different interests, from the design side, funding, regulation for the builders themselves, for the owner builders and the clients, quite a wide range of different interests. So here you've got the website above, the homepage, and then below you've got some of the resources which are on that website to do with training, to do with standards. There's quite a lot of material already there. As an organization, we don't have, we're not at the point of having lots of paid staff. So a lot of this work gets done by volunteers. It takes time to put this stuff up and get it out there. But little by little, we're increasing that presence of information. And this is in quite a contrast to where we were 10 or 15 years ago, where there really weren't those sources of information sort of widely available. You had to go to a library and find a book, and you know, obviously the scene has changed quite markedly. And so being an organization, we're able to then network with other organizations. I should say that we started because our German colleagues had already begun. Dachverband Lehm began in the early 90s, and they said to us, why don't you have a national organization? And as soon as we did start, we were then approached by a group of European organizations to think about training learning outcomes. And so the image on the top left, Ekvet Earth Building, is a website where all of the units of learning outcomes exist, and they exist in 8 different languages at the moment. And we're trying to encourage other language groups to open those units, Google Translate them, put them into other languages so that it becomes a global norm, not just a European norm. Vocational education and training is something that over time people have resisted the idea that you can teach, or that you can standardize, or that you can or that you can standardize products or processes. And this is one of the things that we are trying to challenge in some way and say, yes, actually these things can be done. Over the same period, so now there's a UNESCO chair, and we are the UNESCO chair organization for the UK. And wherever there is a national organization, they can apply to be a UNESCO chair member. And that helps them again to reach across to colleagues in different parts of the world or closer by. And those are useful, they're incredibly useful possibilities for people perhaps working very singularly to reach out. And then the 2 projects below, COBOGE and JUMP, one is looking at COB as a process and whether it can be upgraded to meet thermal standards that exist in the UK and France and in many other places as well. And JUMP is a project that we're working with, again, with a group of European network organizations looking at training for trainers in earth structures. So there's a whole lot of things that it's much easier to work with other organizations and to research and to develop policy and other areas when you're working with different countries. And obviously as an organization that's not commercially fixed, we're an NGO, it gives us the ability to pull in different members for their particular skill sets. We have quite a lot of social media that we use, and so these are images of various different groups that we have started ourselves or that our regional groups have begun, and we're really keen to help regional groups get going, and not just to be a national organization, but to be a local organization as well, or representation in regions. And we found that the interests of different regions can be quite different because the geography and weather and other kinds of variations between Scotland and Wales, Wales and England, England and Ireland, warrant that kind of spread, but also that local network groups work together, develop things, and then present them to the wider group. So, and then finally, we, you know, where we are now as of compared with 10 years ago is that we've been running a conference series over the last 10 years. Clayfest then became a very hands-on event that we've been running for the last 5 years, where people get together, run workshops, work together in different locations around the UK and Ireland for a week, getting their hands dirty. Having a trowel in your hand and some mud makes for a different kind of communication than having a cup of tea in a break in a conference. And it was something that we realized was could be a very positive way of moving forward. So Clayfest this year is online. You can see it's coming up in a month. But we're also trying to encourage other groups. In this case, the top left image there's a Facebook group for Zimbabwe, and we're trying to encourage the Zimbabweans to start their own organization, which is really up to them to do and to decide what that organization looks like. And we will try to support that as much as we can. And we can fundraise here in order to be able to do those kinds of things. So I think that's basically what I wanted to say is that there's a lot going on in the earth building world that that wasn't happening 10 years ago, and certainly not 20 years ago. And acting as a group, publishing as a group, networking as a group with other networks accelerates these processes. And since it's difficult to give Earth a voice, which is kind of what we're trying to do, joining those voices together and hearing the different things that people are doing and trying is very important. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Sourabh to hear what he has to say, and I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you very much.
Can you hear me now? Is the first question everyone asks on Zoom, so I'm asking the same question.
We can, yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. So if you look under your chair, there should be a little brown bag, and networking in the built earth world is what's written on it. So just pick up the bag and open it, and what you'll find inside is basically three things. The first thing is a pair of 3D glasses, because what you're going to see in the next 10 minutes is quite lacking in depth. So I felt that this might help fluff things up a bit. The second thing is you'll find some boiled sugar sweets. These will be handy because we are going to be covering a lot of terrain in a very short time. So those of us who are slightly prone to motion sickness should pop one of these sweets right away. And the third thing, of course, is a travel company brochure, because I'll be taking you around for the Indian edition of looking at what's happening in the earthen world. If you open the brochure, this is what you'll see. And intelligent people will soon observe that basically what could have been a very straightforward, simple route to understand earth building has been turned into a lopsided, circuitous, detour-filled road. And in my defense, the only reason there are so many detours is because there's road widening works everywhere. And by that, I mean that I'd like to widen the scope of the discussion around earth building. And so this is where we begin. This is sort of the scenario that we are standing in. A large chunk of India lives in earthen buildings, but almost nobody wants to be in that space. So it's quite interesting that in some sense, the numbers targets have already been met, but qualitatively, something's incredibly missing. And that is sort of at the root of the questions that I'd like to ask. And before I get into that, just out of curiosity, I think there's about 50, 60 people here. If anybody out of this gathering lives in an earth building or in an earthen dwelling, could you quickly just message the moderator just to let her know that, yes, you live in an earthen building? This is a quick census just to understand what are our numbers also. Let's say out of 60 people, we'll try and find out how many of us actually live in earthen buildings. So if you do, now's your chance to vote for yourself essentially, but just message the moderator so that we will find out how many of us actually are operating in this ecosystem.
Good question, Sourabh. I can see we've got 3 already who have come back. We have Eric, Yegletu, Kirk, and Isaac, all of whom, and Becky, and Kurt. So
the numbers are rising. That's great. Maybe
yes.
if we wait a few more minutes, the whole group will be in earthen buildings at this rate.
Exactly. Yes. Keep telling us, everyone.
Okay, 5 more seconds, and after that, the voting lines stop. Okay, what's our final number?
Let's see. We have Duncan, Joseph, Lisa, Kurt, Becky, Isaac, Kirk, Yegletu, and Eric. So that is 9.
And how many of us are here?
We are 59.
59. 9 out of 59.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And just to make things clear, there's no judgment here. I'm personally sitting in a cement and brick structure myself, so who am I to say anything? But it's for the 9 people who do live in earthen buildings, great for you. The rest of us, the 50 of us who don't, there's something that I'd also like us to bear in mind while we are engaging with these questions around earth building. How is it that we relate to this realm of earth building while acknowledging that we are looking at it from the outside in? And how does this position affect the way in which we engage with these matters? Just something for us to bear in mind as we move through this realm. Because I feel in order to understand Earth as a material, it's important to take a step back and understand Earth. That's no wordplay. I think it's critical that we understand that what we sometimes treat as a material is actually just a node on a much larger continuum, because Earth could be a material, it could be a resource such as land, it could be shelter as in dwelling, it can also be an overarching culture. And you could plot many other points on this continuum. I'm just showing 4 of these just for the sake of conversation and to keep things simple. So this quadrilateral that we have could very easily be turned into a circle with infinite points. But at this point, let's just stay with 4 to begin with. And each of these could be further broken down into constituent elements. These are the elements that we are confronted by on a daily basis. And these are the things that we know intimately through experience. And these elements actually interact with each other and cross-fertilize and cross-contaminate to create a rich and diverse ecosystem, which we need to also be aware of. Another thing to put on our awareness list is that it's not just happening in one single continuum, it's happening in a multi-layered system. So our little earthen culture is contained within a culture, which is contained in another culture, which is contained, so on and so forth. It's like a picture-in-picture technology, or wheels within wheels. And one thing to remember is the larger the wheel, the slower it moves, and the more difficult it is to affect its movement. The smaller the wheel, the faster it moves, but large changes can be brought in with relative ease in smaller elements. This is something that I'd just like to put on the back of our mind again, because we'll be coming back to it later. It's also important to understand what are the shifts that are taking place in all these elements that we were plotting about on that quadrilateral. Because if you think back even 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago, depending on your age, of course, think of what you can remember in terms of an earthen context and look at now and think of the massive shifts that have taken place. These are just a few sample elements that I've stated. There could be many others. And we can take any of these as a random example, and you will see there are massive shifts. For example, in terms of time, earlier earthen structures, the way in which the building and the process was planned was largely based on seasons, on agricultural cycles, so on and so forth. It depended on how much time people had and so on. Now it could be that the building is timed based on an Excel sheet, or it could be based on other synthetic concerns at the same time. So things are changing all the time. And a lot of change has happened in a very short period. So material which has been around for almost forever is suddenly confronted by a lot of change in this tiny time. And that is where something doesn't overlap. Now, when I'm saying this, I'd like to clarify that I don't wish to hurt anyone's feelings. It's not to be bitter or be angry or come from a cynical space. In fact, I'm saying that Earth is irrelevant as an observer, as somebody who's interacting with it. And it's with the same amount of emotion as, let's say, I have a puncture. So I'm saying it with the same amount of emotion that we have a flat tire. I can see it. I'm not annoyed with the wheel. I'm not angry at it. I'm just seeing what there is and acknowledging that this is what is happening. But at the same time, it's great to see what has happened because it gives us an opportunity to address what's happening. If we are lacking relevance, what is it that we could do to it is the question. And I feel as Earth builders, we are probably the best placed to confront relevance because almost every act of Earth building is an act of building relevance. If a piece of mud plaster is losing relevance, we scratch it off, we mix a new mix, we wet the wall, we float the mix back on and build relevance. It's an overlap, it's an interaction between material and time and space. And that is what we engage with all the time. So being irrelevant is of no concern to us because that is what we play with all the time. And the second thing is the wheel that was moving really fast is now jittering and stopping, which isn't that bad if you think about it, because finally we can make some changes to the wheel, which we couldn't have done before while it was moving. So now that it's not, we could ask ourselves, what is it that we wish to do with this opportunity? So do we want to just fix the puncture and keep moving? Do we want to change the tire? Do we want to change the entire wheel assembly or get into the workings of the vehicle itself? I don't know. But at this point, I feel it could be a great opportunity to actually create radical shifts in the system that we are working with. So fixing the puncture itself will postpone the opportunity that we have at this point into the near future. It won't do anything larger than that in that sense. But we could also think of how we could overhaul the system in creative ways that actually contribute to the larger vision that we have for the process. And of course, this isn't a gathering of puncture shop owners, so I'm aware that it's about Earth. So the question essentially isn't about tires, it's about how do we make Earth relevant, but Earth not as a material, but as a larger continuum that we are engaging with. And my concern is that it's quite seductive to come up with short-term puncture patching solutions. For example, it's quite easy that we could turn Earth into another post-industrial material which we can promote, which we can treat and objectify in very materialistic ways, rather than looking at opportunities that the material comes along with. So it's just something that I feel we should be aware of in the given opportunity. Considering this, I feel there's three simple propositions. I don't know simple whether they are or not, but in any case, there are three ways in which I feel we could address systemic concerns. The first I feel is globally relevant. The second and third are more Indian specific or more relevant to the Indian context. So let me just look at the second and third to begin with. The Indian construction scenario, including earth building, is highly gender bifurcated. If you're a woman working on a construction site, you'll probably earn half that of a male counterpart if you're paid at all. a large part of women in the workforce are not paid and are simply looked away from. So when we are looking at addressing earthen cultures, I feel looking at gender components is critical to creating a new system and a new culture of revival. The second thing is the caste system is rampant in most aspects of Indian society, and the culture of construction is no different. Who you are and what you are allowed to do on a construction site can be pre-decided many a times. I feel it is important that we completely demolish this sort of nonsensical hierarchy and come up with a much more egalitarian way of engaging people together. This was more for the Indian context. One thing which I feel is globally relevant is the trinity of the head, heart, hand, or the lack of it. I feel that the construction industry or the earthen culture, earthen construction culture even, the head and the hand are far away from each other and the heart is nowhere in sight. By that I mean that the thinkers, the designers, the architects, the engineers sit in one place. And then you have the workers, the laborers, the craftspeople who are sitting someplace else, and there's a pipeline in between them. We sort of need to mix things together to create a new genre of people. We need to create designers who are capable of doing things. We need to create people who work with their hands, who are capable of thinking out things and designing things. And of course, we need the heart element to come in strongly. So we need compassionate individuals capable of executing what they are dreaming up. And this needs to reflect itself in not just education and not just construction, but in every other aspect of life. I know that what I'm talking about is incredibly generic in a sense, but I mean it completely in a very earthen context, because I feel earth as a material has been doing well for itself for thousands of years. It's the rest that we need to take care of. And that's where our efforts will pool in together and probably create some change. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Sourabh. Thank you very much. We'll go straight to you, Ben, now. Perfect. And you're already ready to go.
Okay, great. I assume everyone can see my screen. Well, thanks first to Jules and Harriet for putting this on. I think it's an extremely important topic, and one that that I think a lot about is like, how do we network within the earth building community? We've struggled in the United States to do it just within our own borders. And I think opportunities like this to talk about it, to a more international audience, and perhaps even more importantly, actually be networking with an international audience is really, really a great opportunity. And I'm happy that perhaps this is the one good thing that's come out of COVID, is that we've all learned how to use screen sharing software. So hopefully this can continue once we're past the pandemic. So I am going to speak a bit about why we don't have a national earth building association for the United States that would act as an umbrella similar to the ones that Rowland was speaking about. And then that's not entirely an apology, because I think we've come up with a model that that is working very well, at least within our own borders. And I think there's some potential for it, for the model to work internationally as well. So here we go. Great. So why doesn't the United States have a national earth building organization for that can organize and coordinate activities like research, advocacy, training, and code development? We know that there's lots of great examples of this around the world that that we could be following. And primarily, I mean, I think the first challenge that we have in the United States is simply one of geography. We're a really big country from an area standpoint. We also have somewhat lower population density than a lot of places, particularly in Europe. So one of the first challenges that we have not yet overcome is simply the separation, between people. We have a huge amount of regional variation in construction practices and regulation. The way that earth building occurs in the United States is very much about where you are. We have adobe work, which is primarily concentrated in New Mexico and Arizona. Rammed earth, which is mostly California and Arizona, compressed earth block, which is mostly in Texas, and then cob, which appears mostly in Northern California and Oregon. So although all of these are sort of crammed into the lower left-hand corner of the map, we're still thousands of miles apart, and each of these constituencies, is responding to different economic conditions, regulatory conditions, and climatic conditions, which makes things a little bit tricky. We are challenged by a lack of financial incentive and backing. We're in a funny time, not funny, ha-ha, politically in the United States. And there is very little will right now to provide public funding for sustainable building technologies. Even our commitment to reducing carbon emissions, has been under threat for the last couple of years. So there's no money coming from above that can help us. Universities and colleges that have traditionally hosted, similar organizations are facing disinvestment from their core educational priorities. So adding anything on top of that is sort of a non-starter. And then in terms of funding from the earth building industry itself, that's hard because industry isn't really the right word. We have a lot of different individuals who are interested in earth building, practicing earth building, but the quantity of individuals who actually make their living from the design, construction, material supply of earthen buildings is actually quite small, not really enough to subsidize the overhead and administration of a national organization. And then, what comes as a surprise to a lot of people is we've just got really crazy tax laws here for nonprofit organizations. So on one hand, nonprofits that are allowed to provide education, research, and training are allowed to get some tax-free benefits, receive grants, that sort of thing. But if you're doing advocacy, that's considered lobbying, and so in many cases you're not eligible for grants. So trying to find one organization that does everything trundles into all sorts of complicated tax law stuff. And then finally, I think the biggest challenge, which we have stumbled over, at least historically within the earth building world, is our kind of do-it-yourself culture. United States, for better or worse, is made up of a lot of people that are relatively independent and have kind of do-it-yourself attitude. I would say that that much more true for the earth building community. Like the folks that really created the earth building culture and advocated for earth building in the 60s and 70s, were pretty, they're kind of like prophets. They're tough individuals, not, really fierce individualist types. And the thing is with that, and you can see here, this is like one of the canonical texts about earth building in the United States by P.G. McHenry. It's right there on the it's right there on the label, like Adobe, build it yourself. What we don't have, is a culture around earth building for the most part, where people come together, build a building, as part of a community. Within the straw bale community, like timber construction, some of these other so-called alternative construction techniques, there's really sort of a collective attitude that comes with them. Adobe, like when I first started getting into it, most of the publications that I saw were about like doing it by yourself, setting up your homestead far away from everybody else. Here's some information on the bullet resistance of exterior walls. It's not, it was not a culture of joiners, So we have, from the outset to overcome that. There's a resistance to convention just built into people's interest in alternative construction. Some skepticism about hierarchical organizations. And the whole idea of regulating an alternative, so-called alternative building material was a little bit antithetical to the whole philosophy, like rules. We're trying to get away from rules. We want to like have freedom to build the way that we want. And so what that looks like when you're trying to collaborate among these different groups is a bit of a standoff. There's a little bit of skepticism between the different factions. There is not really a common language or set of interests in a lot of cases, and so it created a lack of common ground between these different groups. And so interestingly, this is changing. Part of it is because of the changing demographics of the folks that are interested in earth building. Another big change has been that the United States previously was mostly broken up into regions for purposes of building regulation. But now, just since the 2000s, building codes are becoming more unified and coordinated. We have this thing called the International Code Council, which is a funny, that's a funny name for an organization. It's just about the United States, really, speaks to some of their ambitions, I guess, more than the practice. But they have managed to create a code that's used in some form in all 50 states. But what happened was when that started to occur, the regional and municipal codes that had been created, during the 70s, 80s, 90s for earth and construction, they started to get lost by the, because this large national code body just did not have an interest in these small factions or constituencies. So what happens is, in order to affect change at the national level, in order to preserve local and regional earth and building practices, you have to join them. And, it looks a lot like this. This is what grassroots advocacy looks like in the United States right now. It's a couple folks like myself testifying in front of a very professional, skeptical, somewhat disinterested panel of folks that, if you do everything right, will kind of reluctantly let you bring your earth and materials into the code. And the way that we've done this without a national organization is to use a different model. And it looks a little bit like this. If the previous approach was a bunch of like rugged individuals, we've now created sort of a constellation of organizations that all have their own specialties and kind of band together for the big important stuff in order to coordinate and affect change. And I'll just speak through these really quickly. From the code and standards standpoint, we've got the International Code Council, of which many folks, at least a handful of folks, architects and engineers mostly, are members. ASTM International, which is the international standards body, Masonry Society, all of them develop codes and standards for all sorts of things, but also include some aspect of their work that touches on earth and construction. We have our trade association, the Earth Builders Guild, which is a 501c6 that does code development and advocacy, tries to create greater opportunities, economic opportunities for earth and construction. We've got Adobe in Action, which is education and training nonprofit, who also works to enable owner builders, primarily in New Mexico. We have method specialists like the Cobb Research Institute, who are mostly based in Northern California, just dealing with Cobb. The Earth and Construction Initiative, mostly in Texas, which deals with stabilized compressed earth block. And then the Earth Builders Guild, also, like, we do quite a bit of work with Adobe. So the trick to operating without a national organization is creating communication and coordination between all of these different groups that can take advantage of tax laws, grant opportunities, have special relationships with their local regulatory bodies, that kind of stuff, so that we're working as a cohesive whole, even though we're kind of fragmented into these little groups. And so it's been a slow process, but we've gotten some great successes, and I think the foundation for future work is well set. There was an international effort to create an ASTM standard for earth and wall systems, which has been incredibly important in legitimizing earth and construction in the United States. In 2016, we defeated a proposal to remove Adobe from the International Building Code. It had been in there since the first draft, and Trade Association for Conventional Construction tried to have that removed. We've made major updates to the finish portions of the code. So earthen and lime plasters are now allowed for the first time. And then just this last year, the Cobb Research Institute gained provisional approval for Cobb within the International Residential Building Code. It's never occurred in, been allowed in a code in the United States up until this year. So major things are happening. And it is through the coordination of these different groups that this is able to occur. Looking ahead a little bit, there's some things on the horizon that everyone is working towards. In 2025, one of the reference standards that earthen codes rely on is going to be retired, and we have the option to either create our own or again deal with Adobe and compressed earth block being removed from the building code. So that is a very serious threat that we're organizing around. But we're also seeing huge opportunities. They're happening mostly regionally, but building codes in the United States, believe it or not, mostly driven by local municipalities, are starting to recognize that climate change is a risk to life and health of a similar scale as traditionally recognized threats like fire or structural failure. Northern California, some municipalities have enacted low carbon concrete code, which, although that sounds like concrete, well, that doesn't sound great. Actually, earthen building materials are considered concrete under this code. So it's a sneaky way of using an accepted term and sort of broadening its contents in order to allow traditional construction. So I guess in closing, what I would say is that in circumstances where there is not a broad umbrella organization, that's not a fatal problem as long as folks are willing to work together and sort of specialize within a network to take advantages of the opportunities that are out there and leverage their individual and sort of organizational strengths to help other organizations achieve their goals. And I will hand it back.
Thank you, Ben, very, very much. That was hugely informative, but also made really good use of film stills, which is that's a nice combination. Thanks to all three of you. That was, yeah, just very interesting. Your different geographies that you represent, but all with the same material in its many different ways and forms. And I think a reflection I certainly had throughout was lots of you talking about frustrations and what isn't happening, what could be happening, what should be happening. But still, certainly the sense I was getting of feeling incredibly optimistic that there are people out there working at it who are being honest about what the challenges are and really working towards finding the solutions and persisting as well. So it's great. And thanks to all of you. And I hope there'll be lots who are in the audience who will be inspired to do more. And it was 10 in the end, Sourabh, out of the 59. We had one last come forward to say that they were also living in an earth house. So I am now going to hand over to my colleague Jules, who's INTBAU's Program and Communications Coordinator, and she's going to lead off some discussion and then get to questions from you, the audience. So please type those into the chat box. I know there are a couple already, but let's have some more. Jules?
Thanks, Harriet. Hi, everyone. I've got a couple of questions for the speakers myself, and then we'll move on to the audience ones. So I suppose we could start off with a question, quite a generic one, but it might be quite interesting for everyone to know how you all got involved in earth building, and are there examples here that others could follow? So who'd like to start? Perhaps Rowland?
How did I get involved in earth building? I got involved in earth building because what I most wanted to do was to go to Africa. And so I went to Africa, and that somebody said, oh, there's this project to build a house. Do you want to build a house? So I sort of fell into it, and then thought, actually, it answers a lot of money questions. I wasn't really thinking about the material and all of the incredible things that the material does, other than you can build walls out of it. I was thinking, this is something about affordability and so on. And then little by little, you get sucked down into the sinking sands of what Ben's been talking about, what Sourabh's been talking about, attitudes, indifference, regulation, all of that. And then you find yourself picking up more and more of these issues. But right at the beginning, it was kind of, I was in Africa, wanted to do something. And then the other sort of bit of it, which is that I'm quite bloody minded. And so I just sort of couldn't let it go. And I think that is something which probably the other two will also recognize, that it is something that you have to really stick at, because it's not like joining a bank. Yeah, they don't pay you a lot. And there's not a lot of kind of career perks. So you really got to cling on to the thing that you enjoy.
Great. Would one of you, Ben or Sourabh, would you like to go next? How did you get involved in earth building?
I took a pretty conventional route in architecture just out of school, and was working for firms that, although they had an interest in sustainability, it was you know, I was working on like large tech campuses and that sort of thing. I did Google's original headquarters. And so one of the things that happened to me is that I got a little bit disenchanted with the type of sustainability that that was being practiced there. I kind of call it checkbook sustainability. So it's like, well, don't change anything meaningful about the project, just spend more money and add more stuff, right? Photovoltaics and all this sort of thing, which certainly has benefit, but you know, it's not the most efficient way to do it, and it's not addressing underlying problems. So, you know, call it a personal and professional crisis combined with longstanding interest in earth art. I took a leave of absence, moved to New Mexico, took classes in northern New Mexico in traditional building, and then eventually I was well enough to return to the civilized world and to like kind of combine my experience, you know, working with regulatory bodies and that sort of thing, but to, you know, try and help code or help Adobe specifically get greater recognition. So it started just with a small thing, trying to help out on like individual problems that the builders were getting permits. And then at some point you realize it's like, well, we just need to rewrite the entire national code, and like, I won't have to do this anymore. So here we are.
And Sourabh, yourself, yeah, how did you get involved?
The storyline is similar to the other two that you've just heard. It's the only difference I would say is that I started building with earth not because it was ecologically or socially relevant. I was a school teacher and we needed to build classrooms. So I wanted to build classrooms for the children, which sort of embodied the values that we wanted the children to experience. So it's more about what is the unsaid that a structure propagates than the physicality of it. So that's, I think the educational route got me into earth building.
Okay, fantastic. We've got some really lovely questions coming in, so we're going to segue straight to the ones from the audience now. Starting off with one from Duncan Phillips, who's asking, I think everyone on the panel, I'd like to know if there are any accredited qualifications globally to educate and learn about earth building. Does anyone have any suggestions?
Well, yes, I'm just going to kick straight off. There is the European Community Vocational Education and Training set of learning outcomes, which I talked about, which are recognized by a group of earth building organizations in Europe. And in that recognition, across different countries, they gain a certain strength. They're not recognized nationally, except in a couple of territories like the UK and the Czech Republic. But their existence means that, and their commonality means that people can go from territory to territory and gain training in different things. So what Ben was talking about, different techniques and processes happening in different bits of America, the same is true in Europe. You know, cob is more common in certain bits and round earth in other bits. So it may be that you're thinking you'd like to do round earth, but you're in the wrong bit. So you can now go somewhere else and train with other people, but to a set of learning outcomes which are common. And this means that, and these are learning outcomes. They're not training methods or systems. So however you train, if you work mother and daughter, father and son, or in a training center, or in a big commercial building site, is irrelevant, as long as what the information that is being passed and can be asked and measured and assessed. And that group of learning outcomes then makes it very kind of flexible, and it could work in India or China or the US or Africa or South America. And we've had a little bit of road testing of those things in bits of Africa and bits of South America, and we've seen that they do work in very wide completely different contexts. And why I guess I'm kind of interested to be having this conversation with people in different bits of the world. Say in the Middle East, if you don't have a national organization or a regional organization or a series of regional organizations, as Ben was talking about, really solid models for networking and getting together, if you can pull yourself together with a group of like-minded architects, engineers, whoever it might be, you can draw those learning outcomes down, you can translate them into your local language, and you can, they have a certain weight to them because they've been adopted by so many different territories. So that's the best that I can say.
That was a pretty good answer. We've got another really great question. I think maybe we could change, unless either of you, Ben or Sourabh, feel that you need to come in on that one. One from Catherine in Peru, who's asking that the main problem with earth building there is that it's very problematic, that the idea that concrete or brick is better or more modern. And do you have any similar challenges in your own countries? And if so, any ideas how to challenge these paradigms?
Well, I think within the United States, I think there's two parts of that, right? One is a matter of cultural perception, and in many cases, earth and construction is considered to be an impoverished or substandard, material for housing. Here in the U.S., that's historically been true, but we are also seeing that there is a ton of interest, and actually earthen buildings can command much higher prices in resale. So this has been a major issue in Texas, Marfa, Texas, which is sort of an arts community. In Santa Fe, actual adobe or earthen buildings are worth more and are extremely desirable. The bigger challenge that we have is in the regulatory environment, the suspicion of earthen buildings, because they are not engineered or professionalized. And I think much like Peru, on the west coast of the United States, we're in a seismic area. So trying to justify or show that earthen buildings can perform as well in a seismic event as concrete or frame construction is very difficult, because they're just asking us to provide a higher level of justification than has ever been used for these conventional building materials. And it is a challenge, but I think it's mostly regulatory and not cultural.
Okay, another question from Binny and Haley for you, Ben, actually. So if you wouldn't mind keeping your mic on. He wasn't quite sure what you were talking about when you were saying that the DIY attitude is not such a good path to advancing or promoting earth as a material. And do you think it's possible to reconcile the affordability aspect with the potential commodification which could arise, and sort of inscribing it with this sort of expertise? Quite a long one.
Right.
That.
Yeah, well, I think there's two aspects to it. The positive side of the DIY ethic is that people can build their own homes. That's very possible with earthen construction. There are lots of examples in the Southwest of people doing that, despite all of the challenges. I think that the downside is that sometimes that's coupled with a personality. When you are told by contractors that you reach out to, by the building department, by your insurance agent, by whomever you're trying to get financing from the bank, that they won't support you in your earthen building, it tends to create an embattled, a feeling of being embattled or constantly under attack, and people withdraw rather than reaching out. And that's the thing that I think is important to avoid. When a building official or somebody tells you you can't do something, don't run away and reject them. run at them, like through truthful persistence, you can often kind of break these things down and achieve a lot. And that's true, from an organizational standpoint as well. Like we all like want to encourage people to have agency and be able to do their own thing, but don't forget that there's also a lot of other people trying to do the same thing, and we're all stronger working together than we are alone.
Wonderful answer there. Thanks for that. We've got another one from Monica, who's asked, is earth building only available for new construction? She lives in a standard constructed home, and if we stay here, she's saying she'd like to build in a more natural way. Is it possible to combine the two types of building?
Yes. I mean, there's this very false thing that earth building is about heritage and culture, earth building is about new building, and these are separate worlds. We learn and gather information absolutely from both sides of that conversation. Sourabh, you might want to say a little bit more about it, because you have a foot in both worlds more than I do in a way.
It's a yes, and it depends. It depends on a lot of things, including what is it that needs attention in terms of retrofitting or addition and so on. But no matter what structure you're living in, no matter what condition it is in, no matter which part of the world you're living in, yes, you can add, amend, and expand using natural materials or earthen materials. So feel free to explore that confidently.
We've got a question from Teja, who's from India, currently studying for a postgraduate degree in urban architecture at Base Habitat Studio. She's asking how you start as an earth architect in Europe, coming from India. I see that there's really quite few architecture firms. Any advice there? I suppose networking and the contacts that you've all been talking about would be a start.
Absolutely. You've got to look to, who it is that's around you, and wherever you're starting, as an architect or an engineer or as a builder or as a trainee or whatever, there isn't an enormous structure of construction waiting to accept you, and so you have to understand that, and you have to be a little bit patient, and you have to be a little bit you have to persist and keep persisting, because little by little you build your own experience so that you can then walk into the next firm of architects and say, this is a building I've done, this is a building I've worked on, this is experience that I have. And very often what I think is the case is that firms cover their own ignorance by saying, oh, well, that obviously doesn't work, simply because they're ignorant of it. And if you can actually bring them skills and knowledge and experience, then you're giving them perhaps more opportunities than they had before. And that's so that it's something that can build itself. Yeah,
and there's some fantastic examples coming through on the chat, I think, to that question as well from other participants. So great, thanks. Keep those coming. If you've got any examples of where she could find work. A question here from Yelda, who's asking, under the current circumstances, how can the development of earth building codes and standards be accelerated around the world?
Ben, how do you see that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is possible. Certainly, there are a lot of challenges when you're trying to create, uniform standards that work in lots of different cultural and climatic conditions. One thing that we've heard in the United States and and I guess the rest of you can tell us what it's true. You know, at the conference that we have every 2 years, Earth USA, we've heard from lots of folks in different countries. It's like, well, if you guys can get your act together and create a model code, then that will give, you know, other countries the confidence to implement something, you know, if not identical, then similar regionally. That was the impetus for the ASTM E2392 that predated me, that David Eisenberg, Bruce King, I think Horst Schroeder. There were a whole lot of people from the international community that worked on that. That was both trying to solve an American problem, but in a manner that would be recognized in other countries. And there have been discussions about turning that from a guidance standard into something that actually has prescriptive language that might be able to be adopted in other localities. But that is quite a project that you know, is probably a good subject for the next Zoom session.
Yeah, because I think you know, my experience is that within the existing standards structures, they have these mechanisms like harmonization. So there's an ASTM standard which we've been trying to harmonize into the UK, and then we get caught up in the bureaucracy that ASTM is a standards body and British standards is a national body, and so they say, oh well, we can't talk to each other easily, and they make these kind of bureaucratic excuses. And this is why you need your network then to come in behind you and push. And because we have a certain experience in Africa of harmonizing standards across Africa, and then in each territory you need your network to swing into action and pressure their national body to agree to a harmonization. And when you have those national body groups in each territory, then things can actually move. And this comes back to in a way the theme of this session, which is that networking bodies, as Ben said, run towards the problem and don't back away and and leave the room. So yeah, there are mechanisms to make these things happen, but they do require, it's not just me, but it's me and all my mates and all of their mates in it to make it happen.
Great, yes, and I'm aware that we've run over time slightly, so I think I've saved the questions. Do get in touch. Everyone should have INTBAU's email and contact details if you'd like to get your questions answered. I'm sure our speakers would be really happy to do their best to get back to everyone. I'd just like to say thanks everyone for joining, and thank you all, Sourabh, Ben and Rowland, and Harriet as well, for being with us today. The autumn series has 2 more sessions left in it, and you can subscribe to become a member on our website, which means that you'll get notifications about the upcoming talks in our newsletter. So I think that's all from me. Thanks again, everyone, and hope you all have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. It's great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.